What tipped me over into starting the OT Potential Club was finding a research article with a protocol for POTS that I still credit with saving me from 2 years of debilitating symptoms. I knew that there were gems like this that could help so many others, but they simply weren't making it into practice. In fact, it takes an average of 17 years for new evidence to enter into clinical practice. The fields of knowledge translation and implementation science have emerged to change this. Today, we are looking at a scoping review of rehab-focused knowledge translation research. To be frank, I think this article was pretty convoluted, which was funny to me since it comes from researchers who are interested in knowledge translation, but it certainly gives us a good jumping off point to talk about the challenges surrounding knowledge translation and the clear need for innovation in this field. After we review this article, we'll welcome to the podcast Tim Dionne, PhD OTRL. His research centers on supporting therapists in quality care delivery through the dissemination of knowledge and implementation research methods. So let's dive in. Welcome to the OT Potential Podcast, where we review new and influential OT journal articles, then invite on an expert guest to help us pull out actionable takeaways that you can implement in your practice starting today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Lyon, OTRL. And before we dive into this big topic of knowledge translation and OT, I wanted to let you know that this podcast may qualify as continuing education for you. You are probably listening to this podcast on a free podcast platform, but to gain CEU credit, you will need to be a member of the OT Potential Club, our OT continuing education platform. So bearing in mind that this could count as a CEU course, I wanted to state our 2 learning objectives so you can be thinking about them throughout the podcast today. Our first learning objective is you will be able to recognize the leading theory of knowledge translation in rehab and where your individual practice fits into this theory. Second, you will be able to identify specific strategies for translating research into your practice. So let's begin by looking at this journal article, and then we will bring on Tim to discuss how this research could play out in your practice. The article we are reviewing today is called Knowledge Translation Research to Promote Behavior Changes in Rehabilitation, Use of Theoretical Frameworks and Tailored Interventions, a scoping review. This journal comes to us from the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, and it was published in 2022. So the article begins with this general introduction to what is knowledge translation. Knowledge translation is a complex yet fundamental aspect of rehabilitation care. We all engage in knowledge translation anytime we put what we know into practice, but often this process happens subconsciously. In its ideal form, knowledge translation is a dynamic and iterative process for 1, digesting the best evidence, 2, applying it, and 3, sharing about it. In a perfect world, this process involves the best evidence from systematic reviews and clinical practice guidelines and is guided by sound theoretical frameworks. So what are these theoretical frameworks and what do they have to do with knowledge translation? There are multiple theories to help individuals translate new knowledge based on their local circumstances and barriers. There is also an abundance of high-quality systematic reviews that evaluate the effectiveness of different knowledge translation strategies. But most of this research focuses on nursing and physical medicine. Rehabilitation, on the other hand, suffers from a lack of systematic reviews of knowledge translation, which leads us to this paper. So what was the intent of this research? The aim of this article was to explore how theories, models, and frameworks are used to guide knowledge translation for rehab professionals, specifically for OTs, PTs, and SLPs. The authors examined the theories, models, and frameworks used to guide 1, the overall knowledge translation process, 2, barrier assessment and intervention development, and 3, evaluation of their outcomes. So what were their methods? Studies were included in this scoping review if they were published from 2010 to 2020, and if they evaluated OT, PT, or SLP behavior change after a knowledge translation intervention. The authors first identified the theories and models used in each study. They then mapped each theory and model to the 73 knowledge translation strategies that are described in the Expert Recommendations for Implementation Change, or the ERIC project. I will link to this in the show notes so you can see what those are. So what were their results? 56 studies were included in this review, and 22 of them involved occupational therapy. So what did they find about the use of specific theoretical frameworks? 16 of the 56 studies included a use of a specific framework to guide knowledge translation, and some used more than one framework. But one framework really stood out as a clear favorite, with 13 studies citing it, and that is the knowledge to action framework. For members of the club, I'll have a picture of this framework inside our show notes for you. And I definitely just encourage you to Google and look at this framework. Basically, it is a circle that has about 10 main components that follows knowledge translation from creating the knowledge to eventually evaluating and sustaining it. For the individual practitioner, I would say the parts that really apply to us are to access this knowledge that's been created, implement it, and then find some way to evaluate and sustain its use. So what did the authors find about the barriers to identification and implementation? 39% of the included studies reported using barrier assessments to tailor their interventions. Most were conducted informally, and only 4 articles articulated how they use the information to select specific strategies. 18 specific knowledge translation strategies were identified. I'm going to go ahead and just read the first 10 of these so you can hear what these knowledge translation strategies actually are. I think that helps to demystify this work because they're going to sound very familiar to you. 1 are educational meetings, 2 educational materials, 3 model or simulate change, 4 tailor strategies, 5 barrier assessments, 6 reminders, 7 ongoing consultation, 8 facilitation, 9 train the trainer, 10 prepare champions. And again, these come from those ERIC strategies, which I think is 73 different strategies for knowledge translation. And I will link to those in the show notes. So what did the authors find related to outcomes? Outcomes of tailored knowledge translation interventions were most frequently measured using chart audits and questionnaires. No studies used a formal evaluation framework. Formal evaluation frameworks are often used in the literature for nurses and physicians, so that stood out that these studies lack that formal framework. So headed into the discussion, what did the authors kind of pull out from this information? The authors of this paper suggest that their findings contribute to the field of knowledge translation in 4 important ways. 3 of these items really directly related to their stated intent, so I'm going to start with those. 1, identifying that the majority of research uses a single framework to guide all stages of knowledge translations. Namely, most use that knowledge to action framework. The second important thing that they mentioned was identifying that there is a lack of detailed reporting of local barrier assessment. And the third important thing they pulled out was identifying the need for more rigorous outcome evaluation and knowledge translation. Their fourth and final takeaway, though not something they set out to explore, is important to highlight nonetheless. The authors state that when choosing which best practice to implement, decisions are often based on local knowledge synthesis rather than clinical practice guidelines or systematic reviews. On one hand, this is surprising, as 1 in 11 Cochrane reviews are on rehabilitation interventions. However, a 2020 review of 544 clinical practice guidelines in rehab found that their applicability was limited. There was a lot to take in this article. I think it really highlighted how complex knowledge translation is and how far we have to go in it. I think my frustration was kind of like, we know that, we experience that day to day. What do we do next? And that is why I am so thankful to be welcoming to this podcast Tim Dionne, PhD OTRL. Dr. Dionne earned his BS in Occupational Science and MS in Occupational Therapy from the University at Buffalo in 2010 and worked at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, now the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, for 5 years. He then transitioned to a rehab science PhD program at the University of Buffalo, which he completed in 2019. His research emphasis is on supporting therapists to provide quality care through knowledge dissemination and implementation research methods. improving expertise in occupational therapy across urban and rural settings, and equity of knowledge are his top research priorities. I do want to highlight that while Tim does hold multiple roles, including sitting on the AOTA Commission on Practice, he is definitely appearing on this podcast just speaking on behalf of himself. So without further ado, I will patch Tim into this podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Tim. It's great to have you.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I have been on an emotional journey with this paper. I read it and initially almost felt frustrated. Like I just wanted there to be more actionable takeaways for us. I think I had high expectations since it's about knowledge translation. I wanted to feel like more was translated into my brain. But after sitting with it for a little while, I think I'm mostly feeling excitement about the topic, like seeing how much opportunity there is and just opportunity for everyday OTs to really take hold of this and feel ownership over knowledge translation. There's no magic wand in the sky that's going to make it happen. Like it's really on all of us. So I'm excited to talk about all of that today. But I want to start with you and your story and I guess just hear how you got interested in this relatively new field of knowledge translation.
Well, I've got a couple examples of personal experiences. So my very first job, I didn't really know what I was doing. And I didn't like that feeling. And so I ended up transitioning to another job where I was working at RIC in Chicago. At the time, it was called RIC. Now it's called Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. And I had maybe a half a dozen patients on my caseload with incomplete spinal cord injuries, all asking for specific OT treatments to improve their function that they had. They saw PT research being done on like body weight supported treadmill training and locomotion, all these specialized treatments with research labs. And they were like, what's going on with OT? Why isn't OT doing this? And so I ended up getting trained in neuromuscular electrical stimulation. Had a couple patients who were like, oh, I really want you to do this for me. And me wanting the best for my patients was like, let's figure out how this can help. Turns out no one really knew what to do with NMES protocol wise, like using it, sure. But how do I make that treatment the best treatment it can be to improve their outcomes? And nobody at RIC had a really strong answer for me. So with some colleagues, I presented case studies. We talked about it in groups. We went through articles. We went through research. And there was little to no guidance. And so that's really where my research journey started. I submitted for a fellowship for funding to protect my time at RIC so I could do a study. And we did a survey study asking OTs who work with people with spinal cord injury and how they use eSTEM and like what kind of parameters and all the settings and where they learned to use eSTEM and all this information, kind of state of practice. And so from there, I ended up starting a PhD program and focusing on developing guidance documents that would guide using eSTEM with people with spinal cord injury. And really at the end of the day, it was, I didn't like not knowing what to do.
There's, I think, two themes I want to just pause on there. One, that feeling of not knowing what you're doing. Like I have such a vivid memory of walking in to my first job and feeling really confident in the facility and interacting with people, but then actually walking into the patient's room and feeling like I had no idea where to start. And I was like, how in the world did I just go through this long program and I can still walk into a patient's room and not know where to start? And I'm in the hospital, the most common setting. Like, how is this possible?
Yeah.
So that also is what got me interested in knowledge translation. And I love hearing, so that's kind of theme number 1. And 2 is I just love that your clients were asking for information. That is, I guess it feels to me like the story of our time. Like our clients have so much access to information. And I really see them as driving a lot of the changes that are happening. I know we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Absolutely, though. I agree.
So you have these feelings, you go on to get your PhD, you're specializing in knowledge translation, maybe some implementation science. I'm curious how you use your OT brain in this. Like I look at these theories of knowledge translation, and it's so holistic and it feels so OT. I don't know, how do you feel like you're using your clinician brain or your OT brain today in your work?
Yeah, I absolutely, I focus on the usefulness of it. And so I kind of I changed the definition in my mind of necessarily like of like patient to clinician. Well, how can I provide an intervention to clinicians to meet the goals, the outcomes? And so to me, what's really important is practical usability, whether or not it's understandable, whether or not it has applicability, whether or not an intervention like is possible, like whether or not we can actually use it in the clinic. And to me, that's the most important part, because if a protocol calls for an intervention that requires 8 hours of contact time for it to work, that's just not possible. It doesn't make any sense. And, maybe the goal of the researcher who developed that protocol was to identify an effect through an intervention. And that's great. And that's really important for science, but not important to clinicians. And I think a lot of researchers forget that. They forget that they need to make their intervention applicable and useful, because then otherwise no one will use it.
How does that happen? How do we forget that?
I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of forces that exist, and all researchers tend to be very smart and control lots of details. In the real world, we can't do that. So sometimes interventions get muddied because they're also seeing a speech therapist and a physical therapist, and so the intervention, the effect may change. And so I think lately there's been a big push on implementation science is making these studies as practical as possible so that clinicians can actually use them. And so, which is great, which is a really good movement, a good trend, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like a really necessary and needed corrective force that's happening there, and probably happening for lots of reasons, but just definitely where we need to go. And I'm excited for the push in that direction. Looking at this article, I appreciated seeing the different theories that they pulled out. I think I wanted more concrete and helpful takeaways. I don't know if it was the data wasn't organized how I wanted it to be, but I don't know. What were your impressions of this research? There's so few knowledge translation rehab studies, so I know we have high expectations of the ones we have. We need them to be good. What did you think of this paper?
I thought it was a good example of the challenges that face clinicians in using different KT methods. It felt fairly inaccessible in terms of just direct use, like you were saying. And so, to me, it meant that the utility of this article is for researchers to kind of see what people are using in terms of those theories, models, and frameworks, which there's a lot of resources online that exist for knowledge translation, dissemination, implementation, science of databases of these theories, models, and frameworks. And you can sort them by references, and you can, there's even a spot to leave a review, which this one was I'm thinking of. Not many people have left reviews, but it's still interesting to kind of see it that way. And so this article kind of puts into print with, I think, a lot of people, researchers, and maybe some students who are doing projects on knowledge translation, theories, models, and frameworks. It puts it into print so that people can reference it and see it. One of the, as an OT, the big thing that I saw was that concept map and how small the OT box was. It was a massive PT box. in the visual representation of the number of articles. And so, I mean, that feels, most of this stuff feels like a call to action for me, but it feels like a call to action. Like, let's do something about it. Let's change that. And so, I mean, the big takeaway for me is at the end of the day, we need to switch up how information is spread to clinicians, to just reach more people. Changing it from publishing an article and being done with it to thinking about how we can bring the new knowledge in forms of education to clinicians. Like, how do we teach clinicians who are maybe experts or learning or budding experts, and how do we make them feel supported in these new innovative approaches? Because that's what we want to be doing, is these new innovative approaches, and not something we learned 10 years ago from a therapist who learned it 20 years ago.
Yes.
So I think there needs to be a big effort from researchers to make their research accessible and bring it to people who need it. And I have a couple ideas of how we could do that.
Mm-hmm. What are those ideas?
Yeah. I mean, the big one is podcasts. And I think this podcast is a perfect example of that. A couple of those ideas are things like bringing information to where people consume it. So the internet, so like a wiki style, crowdsourced, evidence-based, referenced database or list of interventions that apply for specific, diagnoses or approaches. I mean, I think that would be wonderful, like a one central location to find, a certain type of intervention. Short form videos like Instagram and TikTok are big ways to bring this information to people. You kind of run into trouble with making sure the information is accurate. Someone could misinterpret what you say. So, I also don't want to gatekeep information from people, but sometimes people don't fully believe what they see in those forms. But it would be a good way to provide some support to clinicians. Another one would be different AI applications or different ways to do this, to kind of vet research articles, to make and maybe score articles with an AI saying well, how practical is this to a clinician, and make that identification ahead of time. So then clinicians can be like, oh, okay, here's the top 5 articles that are most useful for X, Y, and Z. And so, I'm also a big fan of this. The standard traditional knowledge translation models would include things like journal clubs and talking about articles, but then also opportunities like what's called the ECHO model, which was actually started at my university. I'm not sure how long ago, but the intention was definitely pre-COVID, and the intention of it was to promote interaction between rural physicians and physicians who are connected to big hospital systems, to provide problem solving kind of talk. And it was a virtual meeting with cameras, where they had the first 45 or 50 minutes as a didactic presentation on a topic. So like a new intervention or something. And then the second half be just a conversation about a case or any problems that the people in the group have faced, and how they could solve them together. And I love it because it's 2 hours, which is a long time, but it eliminates barriers like geographic barriers. It eliminates access to research databases where you can be like, oh, hey, can you send me that article? Or you end up kind of becoming socially colleagues with these experts and who are interested in the same concept topic you are. So I think ECHO model is a great way to kind of bridge the divide of space, geographic divide, which is a big problem here in New Mexico because we're such a huge state geographically with such a small population. It's the biggest challenge we have is reaching and getting clinicians to all 4 corners of our state. And then another really good example of knowledge translation would be having a system in place within your hospital that promotes education and like lunch and learns and brown bags and all these kinds of of these mechanisms, and administration who support clinicians taking time out of their day to learn about new concepts. And that's super important.
Yeah, hearing your list of ideas of what we can do, I think like highlights what makes me so excited about this, because I'm like, these are achievable ideas. Like we have this problem of that this information isn't being disseminated, but there's like achievable, like we are in the age of information technology. Like this feels like a problem we can solve. It almost feels to me, Tim, like we have the technology to do it. It feels like we're operating in these older business models. Like to me, like the world of research is like this older business model where it's like, it's all geared towards publication, and even like the AOTA is like, or national associations are built around like OT practice guidelines, and we haven't yet figured out a way to like incorporate these new systems in them. Does that seem like a good summary? Like the technology's out there, but we just haven't figured out on many levels how to leverage it yet?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. I mean, we have technology innovation in different areas, that are tied to financial gain. I mean, basically everything is tied to how much money can be made off of this. And in academia, kind of knowledge and innovation is that currency, and so people like to keep it to themselves, and people are in that tower, divided, and it doesn't make for good application. And I think that we can take the last 40 years of practice in the history of practice as evidence of that. And so, changing our academics' approach to dissemination is really vital. And then also the voices of the clinicians saying, hey, we need new methods of knowledge. This isn't working. Yeah, exactly. It's just, it seems silly that everyone carries this computer around in their pocket that can get information instantaneously. And then we sit there and try to figure out how to do one specific thing that we've never done before, maybe in our experience with a patient, and someone else has. And so sharing that information to help each other would just be monumental.
Mm-hmm. This article really focused on theory, and I am a visual thinker. I love a good diagram. I love to pull up like a visual of something in my mind. But when I'm happy to know the knowledge to action framework, but it's too complex for me to pull up in my mind. And the same with the other 20 that they mentioned. Like if this has 22 spheres in the visual of it, I cannot pull it. It's not helpful to me. I'm guessing that other people feel that way. How do you yourself visualize knowledge translation? Like, can we get it down to 3 circles I can hold in my mind, or like something achievable?
Yeah, that's a good question.
How do you think of it?
Yeah, I mean,
we don't need to solve all of it. I'm just curious how do you think about it?
I mean, I mostly think about it between the interaction of the researchers, the clinicians, and the methods, the information. Like if we were going from left to right, researchers take existing knowledge and come up with new approaches or novel ways to measure things, and that novel information isn't making it to the right side. It's not going from left to right. It's getting kind of stymied in between. And so in my mind, what are some facilitators? Like, well, what are some things that we can make that transition better? And so the image I'm creating right now is a circle on the left with researchers, triangle on the right with clinicians, and then a bunch of arrows in between from different sources to help mediate that information exchange. And so how do we add to it? And And yeah.
And hopefully there's arrows pointing from the clinicians to the researchers.
Yes, there needs to be a feedback system for sure.
That feels like one of the big missing.
And traditionally, I think there are opportunities to do things at like conferences where researchers present their knowledge and clinicians ask questions, and, practical applications in settings that we already have, where we can meet and discuss. And I think conferences is a big one. I've got a couple friends who are really focused on doing virtual conferences as a way to like reduce costs and burden of going to physical conferences. But nothing beats sitting in the audience and listening to the researcher who does the thing you're interested in, and then asking questions and getting feedback and giving feedback, and that interaction is really important.
Yeah, as hosting a podcast, I love like the honor of being able to ask, like, what does this mean for clinicians? But it's also terrifying that sometimes I'm the first person to ever ask that. That should not be the only feedback loop there. But I'm happy to be part of it in a small way for sure.
Yeah, and I think you do a great job. I think it's a really important service to be able to kind of grill researchers and just remind researchers that their goal should be to improve clinical care and not necessarily, find a statistically significant comparison in their data, which as a researcher, to be fair, that's often the focus. It's like, how is this data, what is this data telling us? And that, it's a challenge. I often hear, and I've heard this several times, multiple times, that clinician and from researchers and from administration folks, that clinicians should take their time to read research articles and distill it. And I think that guidance is a little misguided, right? The research needs to be more accessible. And again, I think that this podcast is a perfect example of how the research of research being made more accessible to clinicians. So it's very important.
Yeah. Can you tell me an example of an OT knowledge translation success story? Like, what does it look like in practice? This feels like a topic maybe you talk about in school, but we don't get to hear specifics of. Like, what does it actually look like to successfully do this?
Yeah, I think there's a robust system. I think the example that comes straight to mind is when I worked at RIC, we had what was called the RIC Academy, which is this series of clinical education and supports that exist. Half the people who worked there, their job was to organize students in the hospital, but then also provide education to the clinicians. And so, to me, what success in knowledge translation looks like is curious clinicians who ask questions, who are eager to learn, but also there's this environment of support. And you don't learn unless you make a couple mistakes. And so, so an environment that's conducive to learning new strategies, new approaches, and then also at the same time challenging old standards. And then also, this is a bit of a hypothetical scenario, but administration who supports that goal, who's actively engaged in spreading novel research and evidence-based practice to the clinicians, and the clinicians also having a voice in what content's being shared and talked about. So that environment doesn't often happen, and so I think a success story would be a practical one would be where a clinician has a question about a patient, a diagnosis, or they see a response from a patient they didn't expect, and then they go to their resources that they have available, find out an answer to their question, and then able to put it into action. And so I think that's a perfect success story. And so if you're a clinician listening and you're like, I have these questions, seek out the experts and ask them the question, and be the treatment leader or the approach leader in your practice setting, and share your knowledge, because once you learn something, you're the expert on it. And I think we forget that sometimes. And so being open about what you know and what you don't know can be really helpful in that endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have such a personal success story with what you were saying, for myself, it wasn't even with a patient, it was with myself. I had what I now recognize as POTS symptoms for 2 years that were completely debilitating.
Oh, wow.
Found the opposite of help from the providers I saw, and found a journal article. Finally, someone gave me the word POTS. I had never heard of it. I finally got that language. I myself went and found a journal article.
Wow.
And I found a protocol. And within months, I felt like a new person.
That's awesome. That's amazing.
That's my hope for everyone.
Yeah.
There are such gems there that aren't getting disseminated. That's definitely part of my passion behind this work.
I teach neuroanatomy, and we just taught electroautonomic nervous system, and at the end I talk about POTS. So to my students, so students now are my students, at least, are getting that information. So that's great.
That's awesome. How do we find the right evidence to implement? I just read an article before we got on by Lisa Juckett that was also in this topic. And it definitely highlighted one of the problems is just finding and accessing these research articles. How do we find them? Why aren't they all together for us? It doesn't feel like there's a standardized list. I'm kind of should we at OT Potential be making that list? Because it's not unachievable. There's how many clinical guidelines? There's not 5,000. There's 50 high standard ones. Why aren't they in a list for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. It should be. It should be. And let's ask AOTA. Let's do it. Let's partner with them and request this, because I think that they should be the ones making this list and that you're talking about. I think the biggest challenge with making such a list is the fact that there's so many things that OTs need to know in different settings and different populations. It's extremely expansive. And there are clinical practice guidelines. There's a clinical practice guideline clearinghouse. There's all of these different regulatory documents. But when you sit down and read most of them, they're very hard to, they're very legal. A lot of the clinical practice guidelines with the legal language that make it hard to really apply. And the ones that are good to read and use in application aren't necessarily specific to OT. They may be specific to a diagnosis group. And so that makes it a lot harder. As a member of the Commission on Practice through AOTA, my job on that committee is to identify experts on certain topics, that the topics have been identified by the RA through RA motions, what content needs to be addressed. And we identify experts. We have them write practice statements. And so there are these position statements that talk about a specific context. For example, I think 2 years ago, the RA wanted a motion for using dry needling, whether or not dry needling was a modality that OTs can use, and the information behind it. So it just got accepted and approved, and I think it's available on AOTA's website now. But I was one of the document coordinators for that. So basically, they wrote an updated version of a previous one that was maybe 4 to 5 years old, and the authors, who are identified as experts in this area, created a couple new case studies or case examples of different modalities in use, and then made a statement about dry needling in it. And one of the things that I tried and I think was fairly successful with was push back really on modalities that didn't have any evidence in terms of whether or not it worked. And we didn't, these position statements don't necessarily evaluate evidence. But I made sure that any of the modalities that we talked about at least had some evidence in terms of what they do and research behind what they do. And so it gets kind of a tricky situation in those instances because there may be a handful of therapists who use this modality and then a majority who find that it's not useful. And I had a pretty tough time wrapping my head around the lack of evidence on a couple of modalities. And in particular, and this is my own position and not AOTA's position, but my own position on like low light laser therapy. I couldn't possibly understand scientifically how a light can affect cellular respiration. And it's just like a blinking light. And so it took me a long time. I followed all of the research references in every article, and I like dug through it and was just, I basically found a handful of articles that really anecdotally talked about their benefits in OT context. And so I made the writers use references that were applicable and not a document that was printed, like that was published in like the 50s, which is what the original reference was. And so, we made a statement in that document saying that, these should be used with caution and to make sure to understand that there may not be evidence in its effectiveness for specific situations. But it's still things that people do. And I think that that's an important distinction. And I think this is a good example of what the Commission on Practice, their job is, right? Our job is to identify these questionable areas. Well, I mean, what we do, but then also identify maybe, hey, this is questionable. Maybe this needs to be researched. Maybe use caution when using this approach in terms of safety, patient safety, and that kind of thing, and using your clinical judgment to choose that. So, yeah, how do we find where the right information? I mean, AOTA ideally is a source, not always exactly what you're needing, may not be there. And so you kind of have to be creative in finding that information. And I'm going to keep saying this podcast, but this podcast is a good example, right? Like if you need information, there's a whole history of episodes of different topic areas that are very helpful. So,
yeah, something I feel passionately about is, or like we've been so lucky to review some of the AOTA guidelines, but there's so many others from like great resources. I'm thinking of like our arthritis guidelines we've seen. We have a great one coming up on complex regional pain syndrome.
Yeah, fantastic.
So yeah, I'm excited about a reality of like, I'm trying to tease out what my role is in this. And I think we're going to pull together some guidelines, and I hope that can be in like conversation with the AOTA. Maybe that's the beginning of this conversation right now on this podcast. So, one of my dissertation, I created kind of this, what I called a clinical guidance document. And it's a little bit different in terms of clinical practice guideline. And, it used a different approach. But its goal was to be accessible to clinicians. And so, I did a study developing it. I did a study, evaluating it with another group. And then I did a study of just using it in practice. And so, the study was, I gave it to three different hospitals that use Easton with spinal cord injury. And so it essentially asked them to kind of rate whether or not they used it, if it was helpful, the guidance document. And, the cool thing, I think the novel thing about the way I wrote it was clinicians wrote it.
I had expert clinicians use what's called the Delphi process, where you make statements and then you go back and agree or disagree, and sort of this essentially crowdsourced method of development. And it was fairly well received by the clinicians that I tried it out with, whether or not it was something that they would use. And that's just another example of what novel and creative ways we can come up with to help guide practice. Hopefully you'll see that soon. I resubmitting my final paper from that study very soon.
Yeah, that's super cool. And I love thinking about the ways to get the clinician voice into things. I'm always just amazed by the knowledge base that our frontline clinicians have. And
yes.
So I'm excited about ways to share that. Something that you alluded to, like at the very beginning, and I wanted to just touch on explicitly, is the client's role in all of this. When I looked at all of the knowledge translation frameworks, I didn't see the client in there, and they're the driver. Like when we're visualizing it, is it the researcher, the clinician, and the client that are, where does that fit? Or did I miss it in the theories? How should we be thinking about them as a driver of our knowledge translation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. A really important thing to think about. And, holistically, they're absolutely involved. I think the biggest kind of interaction with the client or the patient would be with their outcomes, like we're in relationship to the current status and their outcomes. And so, it's also going to be the driving force behind identifying, when intervention will work and what won't, and what research article to find. You may find a study, for example, I found lots of studies on using e-stim in stroke, but very few for the upper extremity rehab and very few for spinal cord. And so those populations are so drastically different. They still are both neurological disorders, but that really dictates like what information and what is applicable. And so, the interaction when it drives what information you're looking for from the client and the patient. And then also they may express to you, hey, I'm interested in doing this approach. I read about it online, or I'm seeing, my fellow, cohort of people at the hospital, receiving this specialized treatment. Is there anything like that for me? And so, it's very important, because like without having a challenging patient to challenge the clinician, the clinician's not going to be like questioning or inquisitive about how to find more information on it. It needs to be included. And I'm forgetting the name, but I've looked at so many of these models, and there was one that included stakeholders, but it was more so a model focused on translating kind of like into public policy. So it included the stakeholders weren't just people of the population of study, but also caregivers and different folks who are involved in the whole process. And so, it's super important, and it definitely needs to be included when thinking about knowledge translation.
For a practicing clinician who is not at a research hospital, who is just in a traditional practice setting, what's your number one piece of advice to them in this area? There's so many avenues you could go down if you are interested in knowledge translation. Where do they start?
I mean, it starts with what you know and what resources you have available, and then start looking for new ways of getting that information, and different ways of sharing knowledge, finding like-minded folks to meet and discuss different topics, I think Commune OT is an example of OT's, social networking, identifying things, special interest groups, and really take some time to interact with those folks who have the same ideas, the same questions you have, and talk about practical approaches that work, that don't work. Don't be afraid to talk about your failures as much as your successes, because that's how we learn. And being open. I really think that knowledge translation as an effective way to learn and develop your practice is only possible through a social aspect. I think it's an absolute must. You need to be able to share and talk and reflect. Conferences, online, forums. And then, if you're unsure of even where to start, go right to the leader, go right to the expert in that topic area and just email them, shoot them an email and say, hey, I am really interested in developing my practice in this specific area. And, once they share resources or engage with you, you can take that information and share it with your practice or, the people at your local setting. And so researchers are all, people with agendas and things to do, but they also have emails that are accessible. And don't be afraid to email them. As long as you're polite, they'll respond in kind. And I think that's my best advice right now. Keep an eye out for new things that are coming out, new methods. And if you don't like what's coming out, start it. Be the person to start that change. And that's how we get change is really just people seeing problems and coming up with solutions and, getting it to work.
Yeah. That advice is gold. And I just totally agree. There are so many different forms of OT communities and groups out there. Like, find your one, no matter what it is, like whether it's a group at your local hospital or like a worldwide group. There's so many options. Find yours.
Yeah.
And as someone who emails OT researchers all the time, they are awesome. And we are so lucky to have the researchers and the voices that we do have. Yeah. And they respond.
Yeah.
I know that because I do it all the time. So
yeah. And if anybody wants to email me, they can.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And people's emails are out there for sure.
Absolutely.
We're getting close to the end of our time, but I felt like I would be remiss to not ask about the future horizon of this work. And when I think of the future horizon, I think of AI. So I wanted to hone in on that as the final question. What's happening in AI and where is it going to take us in the next, even 5 years feels like a long time horizon in like AI. Like, where are we going there?
There's a lot. Wow. There's a lot. I don't claim to know it all. So, on AI, I think that, any application that exists, using AI on different things, can be applied to OT practice, whether it's note taking or note writing or intervention planning or goal writing, or even beyond in knowledge translation would be like a plain summary of research on a topic, a rating system that could evaluate whether or not it's effective, and something you could apply in your practice and kind of giving this summary. Because I think that's the biggest challenge to this for clinicians is time. It just takes time to read articles and assess it and understand it. And if you've got a way to get it quickly and at your fingertips, I think that would be the best. But in terms of KT, I think there's a lot of opportunities and imagination is endless. When I was a PhD student, I had this amazing idea and my PhD advisor was basically like, that's too big. You can't do that. And, I got this idea, and, if you end up making something based on this idea, please let me know. I'll help. But like, how Rotten Tomatoes is this like rating system where people like, there's experts, but then there's also audience. I would love something like that with research and articles where, maybe an AI reads it and gives a summary or scores it in a specific way. And then basically your app, like as a user of this app, could just be like, and this could be for any field, it doesn't have to be OT. I'm a mechanical, or let's say a civil engineer, and I want to know like some specific fact, and you just type it in and it pulls up the answer with references to an article. And you could be like, I'm an OT, select your profession, and be like, I'm working with stroke and this age range, and this is their deficit, and what's the approach I should use. And so, just like being able to like functionally interact with something that gives you specific answers that you can trust. I mean, that trust piece is not quite there yet, but I think, that would be powerful. To be able to, like I said, we have these pocket devices. If we were just like, in home health therapist, and you were not in your hospital and you didn't have resources, and you just pulled to answer questions, and get support, and that would be great. So those are all things where I wish we were going, and hopefully we will.
Yeah, and all that goes back to my enthusiasm for like, this sounds achievable. Like, Tim, I feel like you could go make that. And the power of democratizing language and really bringing it into the public forum. Yeah. Like, if you're writing something for a true public forum, you are going to write it differently.
Yes.
And that like is that feedback loop, and the technology is there for us. Like,
yeah.
It's just comes down to the business model of like
innovation. Like, how do we innovate when we're trying to make sure we hit our productivity for our job? How do we innovate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think there's exciting opportunities for new business models too.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah.
We've talked about so many things today. My mind's been whirling on this topic like really hard this week anyways, and now it's like whirling even more. What's the takeaway from this conversation? What's the thought you want to leave us with?
I will just say, if you feel lost or left out of conversations of like, well, what do I do next? And how do I get that information? How do I improve my patient outcomes? Like, I always keep, I feel like I'm seeing the same thing over and over, this problem, say something, seek out leaders, ask questions, start a journal club, identify potential solutions, and I always say with this kind of approach, like, if you're really feeling lost, find that information and ask the people, ask a professor that you really trust, or, and at the end of the day, always just, ask for forgiveness instead of permission. Just do it. Just go and start that club. Mm-hmm. Just go ask those questions, because innovate, practice, because if you don't do it, it may not get done. Usually it's if you don't do it, someone else will. But I don't know if that's the case. I think it won't happen if you don't do it. So go for it. That's my advice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. And it just loops me back in my mind to the beginning of our conversation where we both started our jobs and didn't feel like we knew what we were doing. And I know I didn't say that to anyone until now, 15 years later, that I had that feeling. And we need to say those things sooner and ask questions sooner and know that that's okay, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a somewhat powerful anecdote maybe I can leave us with. My very first job was at the University of Chicago, and I mentioned that I didn't know what I was doing. University of Chicago prides themselves, and I will shout out to the management there. They pride themselves on taking the most difficult patients. I, as a new grad, was very lost. I got ortho down, was the ortho floor, and then I got sent to a different floor to train there. And, I was seeing patients that were just not healthy enough for therapy. And it was scary. And, I was fired. That's why I left. because it was 6 months. They were like, we don't want you to stay. And I was like, I don't want to stay. It was mutual. 2 days later, I got a job at RIC. So that was the success story. But I saw that manager for the first time at the last OTA conference. And I told her just straight out open, that the experience at University of Chicago inspired me to figure out and help people who don't feel like they know what they're doing. And so that feeling of helplessness was very challenging. And so I know people feel that way. And I think the answer is find people who will help you, find people who will support you, and find the answer. And it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay not to do perfect the first time. Like I said, I credit, her and that management, those group of managers, into why I worked at RIC. Because at my interview, I was like really open about what I do. I was very nonchalantly, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. And that manager was like, oh, he wants to learn. He's going to do so well here. And so I did. I feel like I did really well. And that really just launched my career as an OT. And that's why I'm a professor today. So, I think it's really important to take these sometimes what seemed like at the time failures and turn them into just massive successes. And I won't claim that I'm a massive success yet, but I like to think that one day something I did will help people feel confident in themselves so that they can be good therapists. And so that's my little anecdote of personal struggle that led to success. Hopefully that helped you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that story. And definitely the success of today was taking this topic that to me felt really frustrating, felt very ethereal, and brought it back to just the really personal, visceral, we want to be doing the right thing. It's embarrassing and hard when we've studied a lot and we still don't know how. So thank you for, just bringing that back. And for this conversation today, Tim, I really appreciate you sharing and being here with us. I'm looking forward to more conversation and more steps in the right direction.
Yeah, more innovation.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of opportunity there. So, thank you for the time today.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, you all, I think that through the course of this episode, we unlocked why an article on the theory of knowledge translation can stir so much emotion. Thank you so much to Tim for getting to the personal aspects of this topic and really driving home why knowledge translation is so important to us as clinicians and for the clients that we serve. I have been really moved by this topic to create more public-facing knowledge translation resources, and luckily we have an amazing capstone student right now to spearhead those efforts. So this spring, the spring of 2024, please check out our site for both an evidence-based practice resource and a resource on knowledge translation. They may not come out exactly with this episode, but they will be out soon after. And as always, I want to hear your thoughts on this conversation. If you are a casual listener of the podcast, we'd love a review from you. You can now review us on Google from our homepage, or as always, we appreciate your comments on our YouTube video. But the best place to really discuss the implications of all of this is in the OT Potential Club. I'll be watching for your comments in our forum. And if you are interested in earning a CEU certificate for your time today, what you are going to do next is head to otpotential.com and either sign in or sign up for the OT Potential Club. Once you are in there, you can take a 5-question test, and when you pass, we will generate a certificate for your time today. And as always, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this podcast helps keep you informed and inspired as an OT professional. Take care, and we'll talk next time.